Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, two ambitious young musicians in 1960s London, faced their greatest obstacle yet, their landlord, Mr. Grimshaw, who constantly mocks their musical dreams while they struggle to make ends meet in a barren apartment furnished only with orange crates. The bitter winter wind howled through the drafty windows of the small flat in Edith Grove, Chelsea. Inside, two young men huddled around a small electric heater, their breath visible in the cold air. The apartment was nearly empty. No sofa, no beds, no dining table, just a few orange crates serving as makeshift chairs, a mattress on the floor, and a record player. Keith Richards strummed softly on his guitar, working through a blues riff while Mick Jagger scribbled lyrics in a worn notebook, occasionally humming along. "That bit there," Mick said, pointing at Keith's fingers on the fretboard. "Play that again." Keith repeated the sequence, adding a slight variation. "Like that?" Mick nodded enthusiastically. "Perfect. It's exactly what the song needs." Their musical moment was interrupted by three sharp knocks on the door. Keith and Mick exchanged knowing glances. Only one person knocked that way. "Mr. Grimshaw," Keith muttered, setting his guitar aside. Mick reluctantly opened the door to reveal their landlord, a portly man in his 50s, with thinning gray hair and a perpetual scowl. Mr. Grimshaw pushed past Mick into the apartment, his nose wrinkling with disdain. "Still living like vagrants, I see," he sneered, eyeing the orange crates and empty space. "And the rent is due, again." "We've got it, Mr. Grimshaw," Mick replied, reaching for an envelope on the windowsill. "All of it this time." Mr. Grimshaw snatched the envelope, counting the money with stubby fingers. "1 day late. Again, we had a gig last night," Keith explained. "The club owner didn't pay us until after midnight." "Ah, yes, your music career," Mr. Grimshaw said, making air quotes. "How's that working out for you boys? Playing to empty pubs and sleeping on orange crates." "We're building something," Mick responded firmly. "The Rolling Stones is going to be a success." "The Rolling what?" Mr. Grimshaw laughed. "Listen to yourselves. Two poor boys from the suburbs thinking they'll be the next Beatles." Keith stood up. "We're not trying to be the Beatles. We're doing something different." "Different? You mean worse?" Mr. Grimshaw walked over to their small collection of records, mostly American blues artists. "Wasting your youth on this rubbish. My son is already working at the bank. Has a proper flat with real furniture. What do your parents think of this?" He gestured broadly at their sparse surroundings. "My father thinks I should be studying economics at the London School of Economics," Mick admitted. "But this is what we love." "Love doesn't pay the bills," Mr. Grimshaw scoffed. "And it certainly doesn't buy furniture." "We don't need much," Keith said. "Just enough space to write and practice." Mr. Grimshaw shook his head. "I give you 6 more months before reality sets in. Then it's back home to Mummy and Daddy with your tails between your legs." After he left, Mick slumped onto an orange crate. "Sometimes I wonder if he's right." Keith picked up his guitar again. "He's not. You know he's not." "We can barely afford to eat," Mick said. "Last night we had beans on toast." "Again, the Stones are getting better every day," Keith insisted. "That gig at the Crawdaddy Club last week, people were really listening. Brian said we might even get a regular spot." Mick nodded, trying to hold on to that hope. "You're right, and we've got that audition next month." "Exactly," Keith said, passing Mick a cup of tea, their dinner for the night. "To the Stones." Mick clinked his cup against Keith's. "To the Stones." 2 weeks later, the pair trudged up the stairs to their flat, soaking wet from the rain and exhausted after another late-night gig. "At least we got paid this time," Keith said, holding up a small wad of cash. "Enough for rent and maybe even some proper food tomorrow." When they reached their door, they found a note pinned to it. Mick pulled it off and read it aloud. "Music practice after 8 p.m. is no longer permitted. Neighbors have complained. Any violation will result in immediate eviction. Grimshaw." "He can't do that," Keith protested. "When are we supposed to practice? We have gigs every night." "He's trying to force us out," Mick said, crumpling the note. Inside, they found another surprise. The electricity had been shut off. "Perfect," Keith muttered, lighting a candle they kept for emergency. The flame cast long shadows across the bare walls. Mick sat on his orange crate, shoulders slumped. "Maybe this is a sign. Maybe we should just—" "Don't say it," Keith interrupted. "We're not quitting. I was going to say maybe we should find another flat." Mick clarified. "One without Mr. Grimshaw." "With what money?" Keith asked. "This is the cheapest place in the area, and we need to be near the clubs." They sat in silence, the candle flickering between them. Finally, Keith picked up his guitar. "We'll have to practice quieter," he said, playing without amplification. "Or earlier." Or we find somewhere else to practice, Mick suggested. Maybe Brian's place? We'll figure it out, Keith assured him. We always do. The next morning they were awakened by pounding on their door. Open up, Mr. Grimshaw shouted. Mick stumbled to the door, still half asleep. What's going on? You were playing music last night, Mr. Grimshaw accused. After 8 p.m. We weren't, Keith protested, joining them at the door. We got home late and went straight to bed. The tenant below says otherwise, mister, Grimshaw insisted. This is your first warning. 2 more and you're out. After he left, Mick turned to Keith. We really weren't playing. It's Mrs. Harding downstairs, Keith said. She's had it in for us since we moved in. This is getting ridiculous. Mick sighed. We need a break, Keith. Something has to change. That night they were performing at a small club in Richmond when they noticed a well-dressed man watching them intently from the back. After their set he approached them. Andrew Lou Goldham, he introduced himself. I work with the Beatles management company. Mick and Keith exchanged excited glances. I like what I'm hearing, Andrew continued. It's raw, it's different. I think we could do something with it. Like what? Keith asked cautiously. Like make a record, Andrew replied. Get you guys some real gigs, real money. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Andrew became their manager, secured them better-paying gigs, and even arranged for a recording session. But they were still living in the same sparse flat, with Mr. Grimshaw making their lives miserable at every turn. Another noise complaint, mister, Grimshaw announced one morning, barging into their flat without knocking. That's 2 warnings now. 1 more. And he stopped mid-sentence, noticing a newspaper on their orange crate. The headline read, Rolling Stones sign record deal. What's this? He asked, picking up the paper. Our band signed with Decca Records yesterday, Mick said, unable to hide his pride. Our first single comes out next month. Mr. Grimshaw's face reddened. You expect me to believe this? Some rag printing made up stories about local nobodies? It's the music paper, Keith explained, and here's our advance. He held up a check. We'll be paying next month's rent early. Mr. Grimshaw looked from the check to the newspaper and back again, his expression shifting from contempt to calculation. Well, he said finally, I always knew you boys had potential. Just needed someone to push you, give you motivation. Mick raised an eyebrow. Is that what you were doing? Of course, Mr. Grimshaw claimed. Tough love, that's all it was. And look how well it worked out. We're moving out next week, Keith informed him. Found a better place, Mr. Grimshaw's smile faltered. No need for that. I could lower your rent, maybe fix that heating issue. We've already signed the lease, Mick interrupted. But thanks for the tough love. We'll remember it when we're playing at Royal Albert Hall. Nigh 6 months later, the Rolling Stones had their first hit on the charts. Mick and Keith, now living in a comfortable flat with real furniture, were interviewed by a music magazine. What was the hardest part of your journey? The interviewer asked. Mick and Keith exchanged knowing smiles. The orange crates, they said in unison, before dissolving into laughter. Years later, when the Rolling Stones had become one of the biggest bands in the world, Keith was signing autographs after a show when he came face to face with Mr. Grimshaw. Remember me? The older man asked, now looking much smaller than Keith remembered. Of course, Keith replied, still renting out that flat in Chelsea. Sold it years ago, Mr. Grimshaw said, for quite a profit actually. Advertised it as former home of the Rolling Stones. Keith laughed. Clever. I was wrong about you boys, Mr. Grimshaw admitted. Never thought you'd amount to anything. Sometimes the people who believe in you the least motivate you the most, Keith said, signing the album Mr. Grimshaw had brought. In a way you helped make the Stones what we are. How's that? You gave us something to prove, Keith said, handing back the album, and for that, I thank you. As Mr. Grimshaw walked away, Keith smiled to himself, remembering those hungry days sitting on orange crates, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. They had turned nothing into something, defying every obstacle and proving that passion, when fueled by determination, could overcome any challenge. Their story wasn't just about musical success. It was about believing in yourself when no one else does, about persevering through hardship, and about the magic that happens when you refuse to give up on your dreams.